Well, for more than 2 millennia, Western philosophy has been captivated by the dream of reason. If only we were to dare to think, as Kant put it, then the door opens up to truth, knowledge, wisdom, an enlightened society, and even happiness. Well, today you'd be forgiven for thinking that that dream lies in shatters. It's been killed by psychologists and neuroscientists who have told us all the ways in which we're actually completely irrational. Reason is the tail being wagged by the dog of emotion and by unconscious processes. We're profoundly gullible, perhaps even especially philosophers who have believed their own hype about the power of reason. Well, my guest today, Hugo Mercier, challenges this new pessimistic orthodoxy. He's a cognitive scientist working at the Jean Nicod Institute in Paris. He's the author of The Enigma of Reason with Dan Sperber, an excellent book, and also an excellent new book called Not Born Yesterday, The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe. He was due to speak at the Royal Institute of Philosophy's London lecture series. It was cancelled because of you know what, but I'm delighted that we're going to have the opportunity to hear some of what he was going to say there today. So thank you for joining us, Hugo.
Thank you very much, Julian, for the invitation.
Well, I just want to begin very generally. The nature of knowledge is something that I think philosophers have often considered to be their domain. So why should we be bringing in psychologists and listening to what they have to say about this subject? Can't we just leave epistemology, as the technical term puts it, to philosophers?
I think it depends on what is exactly the question you're asking. You can ask deep philosophical questions about what knowledge is, what counts as knowledge versus belief, and that's great for philosophers. But if you want to know how people actually acquire knowledge, whether they tend to have reliable knowledge, or whether their knowledge tends to be accurate or not, and what are the mechanisms through which they do all this, you have to turn to psychologists, but not only psychologists, also political scientists and anthropologists and sociologists and social scientists more generally.
So philosophy has traditionally been highly optimistic about the power of reason, but you think the tide has turned. There's this nice quote you give from the philosopher Jason Brennan, who says, "Human beings are wired not to seek truth and justice, but to seek consensus. They are shackled by social pressure. They are overtly deferential to authority. They cower before uniform opinion." And you think that this view of the dark side of communication, if you like, the power of communication to basically fall as in the ascendancy. Is this just an impression you have, or is there any sort of good evidence of this? What makes you say this is now the dominant view, both in academia and in society?
Well, indeed, there's quite a bit of evidence that psychologists and philosophers, and many academic psychologists and philosophers, and as well as quite a few lay people, hold a pretty negative and pessimistic view of the masses, at least of humanity at large, and in particular of people who disagree with them. So, for instance, there's a quite well-known third-person effect by which people tend to believe others are gullible but not themselves. So if you ask people, do you think that other people are influenced by fake news, by political campaigns, by advertising? They will say yes, but are you influenced by all these things? And they will say no. And people tend to be right about themselves and wrong about others. Broadly, philosophers and scholars more generally throughout history, they have been overly optimistic about their own abilities and overly pessimistic about everybody else's abilities. And so they have been overly optimistic about their own abilities because many of them have thought that through the sheer power of reason, typically in a Cartesian manner, they should be able to discover the truth and to reason and to think in a completely unbiased, objective manner. But they also thought that the masses, the peasants, the slaves, the women, the children, everybody who wasn't a philosopher was kind of mired in epistemic, confusion, was kept making mistakes, was being completely gullible. So I think on both counts they're wrong because they're overly optimistic about their own abilities. I mean, they have philosophers and scientists, they have their own limitations and biases. But they also have been pessimistic about everybody else because actually everybody has these abilities. There's some variation, but everybody has an ability to reason, to discriminate truth and falsehood, and all of that is pretty widely shared.
So the two claims you really want to dismiss, and correct me if I'm wrong, are primarily this idea that we're just highly gullible. This seems to be a view, as you say, it's the view the elites have more of the masses, if you like, than the other way around. but also that the less we think, the more we're influenced. And so therefore, thinking long and hard is some kind of immunity against that. Now, before we go into details about that, you think there's a kind of an evolutionary reason why it can't be quite as this seems. There's an evolutionary reason why communication has to be a benefit to both the communicators and the hearers. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, so it's quite well known in the literature on the evolution of communication that, and it's quite intuitive when you think of it, that for communication to exist within any species or even across species, it has to be beneficial both to the individuals that send the information and to the individuals that receive it. And the reasoning is quite simple: is that if it were not beneficial to either of them, then they would stop. They would evolve to stop either sending information or to stop receiving information. And so you can see that. You can see that in real life, and not an evolutionary timescale. But if you start playing poker with your family and your friends, people who you would trust with your life, and you can't, you're not going to believe a word they say because in that context it makes it's purely adversarial, and so just communication breaks down very quickly.
But there is also an incentive. If you're the person sending out information, you've always got an incentive to deceive other people, right? So in order for the communication to be stable, we need counteracting mechanisms, right? So if we really were completely gullible, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be an evolutionary stable system. So how is it that as receivers of information, what mechanisms do we use then to make sure we're not constantly being fooled by people who have an interest in fooling us?
Yes, so just to backtrack a little bit, quite a few psychologists and philosophers, starting with Thomas Reid, have argued that we don't need to be that vigilant because other people are nice, other people are trustworthy. And indeed, if you look at actual communication, lies are very, very rare. People lie maybe a couple of times a day, typically for white lies. And so people might be tempted to think, well, if I listen to most of what at least my friends and colleagues and family tell me, they're being trustworthy and honest. So why should I bother verifying everything and being vigilant? But in fact, this reasoning has it completely backwards. It is because we are vigilant that people are trustworthy. I mean, and it's just such a hard kind of thought experiment. But imagine a world in which people would actually believe everything you tell them. There are many people, I'm sure, who would go to Jeff Bezos and tell him that it would be much better off if they gave him all this money, or there would be a lot of obviously of abuse of the system. And if we don't see all that abuse, it is because we are vigilant. It is because we evaluate what people tell us, and we do that in two broad ways. One is by looking at the content of what people tell us. So if you tell me something that appears absurd given what I already know, I will tend to reject it. If you give me bad arguments, I will tend to reject them as well. And the other solution is we look at the source. So I can see, well, are you someone who tends to have knowledge in a given area? Are you someone who is an expert in a given domain? Are you someone who has been trustworthy in the past, who has given me reliable information? And also, are you someone whose reputation matters? And so if you're a good friend of mine, and if you tell me something that is complete lie, clearly maybe I'm not going to be friends with you anymore. So the stakes are very high for you. And so by figuring out what the stakes are for others, we also know who we can rely on.
Presumably that process isn't conscious, right? It's not like we go through a checklist. So this has got to be quite intuitive, which again is I suppose it counters the prominent view of reason in philosophy, which is this conscious, deliberative process. I mean, what you're suggesting there is we're actually going through what is quite a rational process, but it's all not conscious, I presume.
Yes, it's completely. I mean, in some cases it can become conscious, and in particular, it becomes conscious when people ask you to justify your decisions. Why do you pay attention to what the Guardian says? Why do you trust your mechanic, etc.? And then you can start justifying your decision. But yes, at the moment, when someone talks to you, thinking, oh God, this guy, he has been trustworthy with me 5 times in the past, and obviously this is done completely unconsciously, and this is true for the vast majority of the computations that happen in your mind, whether it's vision, other kinds of perception, motor action, everything. The vast majority of it is unconscious. So we shouldn't be surprised that that is also the case for how we evaluate what people tell us.
So this, and it's called sometimes epistemic vigilance, you call it open vigilance, starts very young with kids. You've got experimental evidence that starts as young as 2. Is that correct?
Yes, even younger. So it's not evidence. I've done some experiments with 2.5. I mean, some colleagues of mine and myself, we have done some experiments with 2.5-year-olds. Some other researchers have done experiments with younger children, and indeed they can show that, for instance, if a child, there's one of these very cute experiments in which I think it was 18-month-olds, and they had to they were crawling on all four, and they might even have been 12 months old. And they're crawling on all four, and they had a choice of either to keep going forward or to stop. And in front of them was a cliff of varying kind of sheerness that was more or less slanted. And in front of them was their mother telling them either that they really have to move forward or that they should stop. And essentially, if the cliff was very sheer, none of the kids decided to go, whatever the mother was saying. If it was completely flat, all the kids went, completely ignoring what the mother was saying. It's only when the cliff was sort of at a medium angle that they were paying attention to what the mother was saying. So they were integrating their own intuitions about what to do to what the mother was saying in a way that was completely appropriate.
Right, so they're already sort of thinking for themselves before they're even perhaps
Yes.
aware of thinking for themselves.
Yes.
And so one thing about this is, if this evidence you put it together, is that despite the fact we have this widespread view that we're gullible and we can be made to change our minds very easily. That's not true. Changing minds is very difficult. And I mean, there were lots of like little urban myths, if you like, that have come down through history, and you sort of debunk some of those around like subliminal advertising, for example. Just is it the evidence that just doesn't work at all, or has it just
doesn't work at all? Yeah. So there was a big hype in the 50s. In which this guy was supposedly had flashed the words "drink Coke" or "eat popcorn" in the middle of a movie, and people had rushed to buy popcorn and Coca-Cola. So in that particular case, the guy had just made up everything. He had just invented that out of whole cloth. Later on, psychologists tried to do more controlled experiments on that topic, and the results have been broadly negative. Some experiments suggest that maybe there are very, very small influences. So, for instance, there's this one experiment in which, by flashing words related to thirst during an experiment, you could make participants who were already thirsty drink a little bit more water. And even that, I wouldn't bet that replicates. So, if at best you would get people who are already thirsty to drink a little bit more water, which is not exactly groundbreaking, and that's even I wouldn't necessarily swear by that. And you have similar myth about brainwashing, this whole scare about brainwashing in the 50s that was just completely made up. Like essentially, so it started when prisoners of war, American prisoners of war, were held in captivity in Korea, and the Chinese and the Korean were supposed to try to brainwash them by depriving them of all their cognitive abilities, by tiring them, for stopping them from sleeping, to making them do hard physical work, etc. And that was supposed to break down on their resistance, and then they could be indoctrinated by kind of communist manifestos. And a few of the prisoners of war did defect and go to China, and so people thought, God, they had been brainwashed. It turned out that actually these people were just afraid of being court-martialed because they had a little bit cooperated with the Chinese captors. And actually, the success rate out of thousands of American POWs, none of them were successfully brainwashed. So it's just none of these things work at all. And that's sort of, so to keep going on this, it relates to the point you were raising earlier about this intuition we have that the less people think, the more gullible we are. And these examples show that it is not true at all, because if you stop people from thinking, either by flashing something very quickly on a screen so they can't even consciously perceive it, or by getting them so tired and physically exhausted that they can't think at all. In both cases, what you get is people who are completely unable to change their minds.
But I want to talk a bit about political campaigning, because here again is something whereby, we really do believe it works. And it's not just, there's the extreme example of Nazi propaganda, which people believe worked. But even in more modern times, so for instance, if I think I'm based in the UK, and if I think of two important political campaigns recently, on both occasions, the person who came, the party that came out on top, just seemed to have a clearer, simpler, more effective message. So in the EU referendum, it was, a simple message that we'd get out, everything would be simple, everything would be easier, whereas the message on the other side was deemed to be confused. And in the last general election, the Conservatives who won, they had a simple slogan: get Brexit done. the other side was seen to have a confusing slogan. So, the received wisdom and all the political commentators are telling us that having those clear messages really, really did make a difference. Now, I'm wondering whether what you're saying is that they're wrong, or whether or not it's simply a matter that because you only need to persuade a few people in the middle to make the difference, that it doesn't follow that therefore most people were persuaded by this stuff.
I think there's a bit of both. So I think in many cases the kind of the political commentariat tend to think of post hoc explanations, for any electoral outcome, and I'm sure that if the Brexit outcome had been the other way around, they would have thought of a very clever explanation why it was obvious all the way that Brexit was going to lose. And we can I don't think there's a single election that they have never been able to explain. So that suggests that, and clearly there are many results that they haven't predicted. So there's a mismatch here that is pretty clear. And indeed, if you look at how successful these people are at making predictions, they're not very good. So obviously before Brexit, a lot of them thought Brexit was gonna lose. Before Hillary Clinton versus Trump, a lot of them thought Trump was gonna lose. And so if these people can't predict elections, it's not clear we should trust them when it comes to explaining the outcome after the fact. If their kind of underlying theory of the election doesn't allow them to predict the outcome, then why should we believe them after? So I think there's a lot of that going on, and we shouldn't trust kind of Monday morning quarterbacking in this domain. The other is that the evidence suggests that the effects of political campaigns are very small, at least in major elections for which most people have an opinion. Brexit might actually be an interesting example because it is a very, very important election, but it's not a topic that people had necessarily all strong opinions about. So, most people would be, on the left or the right. So in most elections, you can use that as a heuristic. But in Brexit, it was not completely transparent. So it might have been a little bit more amenable to persuasion than a general election would have been. But I still haven't seen strong evidence that there was any Brexit-related political campaign was particularly effective. And finally, we do see very, very small effects sometimes. And so, yes, these very small effects might explain winning if you think, well, it makes a difference between 50.1 and 49.9%. But it's also slightly misleading in that if you think, well, it's because of the Russian bots or Cambridge Analytica or whatever that flipped these 10,000 people. You still have to explain why the other 12 million voted the way they did. And so it's misleading both in terms of it's not a very sufficient explanation, and it's misleading in that it points you to the wrong solutions. Like it's not just shutting down Cambridge Analytica and Russian bots isn't going to make a big difference. You need to address some deeper issues.
One of the things I find very interesting about your ideas is that as philosophers we tend to think about whether someone has a belief or not, and when coming from the more scientific psychology side, I suppose there's perhaps more a question of what it means to have a belief, and we hold beliefs in different ways. And this is important, I think, because a lot of surveys suggest that a lot of people have fairly crazy beliefs, right? So a disturbingly large number of people actually believe in this Democrat paedophile ring that was occurring in a basement of a pizzeria in Washington or wherever it was. But there's something I think which is quite important. You say that most of these false beliefs are held reflectively, and you're using that term reflectively in a way that I don't think is necessarily transparent. So what do you mean by saying that these beliefs are held only reflectively, as it were?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the distinction I use there is I owe to Dan Sperber, who drew the distinction between intuitive and reflective beliefs. So. And it suggests that, as you are saying, that the category of belief it's not a very helpful category. It's not like one thing that behaves in a unified manner. And so intuitive beliefs are beliefs, for instance, that you form through perception. So I can see you, I can see my table, I can see outside, I can have memories of what I had for breakfast this morning, and all of these beliefs are completely intuitive. In that I just fully believe them. They can interact with any other inferential mechanism, so I know that the table is in front of me, that I can't go across it, that I can put things on it, etc., etc. By contrast, as humans, we are also able to form reflective beliefs, in which case the beliefs are sort of encased in a context that protects them or that kind of protects the rest of our cognitive mechanisms from the belief. That kind of isolates the belief from the rest of cognition. So, for instance, we know we can hold falsehoods. So, I can think, I can think that that 9/11 was orchestrated by the CIA. It's something I can hold in my head without thinking it true. I can think about it. I can think about counter arguments in a way that is completely isolated from the rest of my beliefs. And so that's fairly intuitive, that we can think about things that are false without disrupting everything and suddenly thinking they're true. The thing that is less intuitive is that we do the same thing for beliefs that we hold true. So, for instance, I believe in relativity theory, and I'm completely sure it's a very good description of reality. But that belief is completely isolated from the rest of my mind. Like, I'm not going to start having intuitions about time, space, distortions, and these sort of things. It's completely it's in its own little box, and it just doesn't have any further influence on my other beliefs or my behavior. And the claim I make in the book is that a lot of the false beliefs that are culturally widespread are of this form.
Yes, I mean, similarly, a lot of people seem to believe that, this idea that the 5G is causing coronavirus. Although I say a lot, about 8% of the British public, I think, in a survey, which is, still leaves 92% who don't. But of those 8%, the vast majority are not tearing down these masts or even stopping using their phones. They would sign a petition and get very angry. And I suppose the thing is, from a philosophical point of view, you might want to say, well, this shows they don't really believe it. But I suppose that's the bogus category, isn't it? There are different ways of really believing. And one way of really believing is just to have this belief in one compartment of your mind. Another way is to feel it intuitively. And they're both real, different strengths, maybe. But
yes, because otherwise you'd want to say that physicists don't really believe in quantum physics, for instance, which is it's kind of not very nice to them.
Okay, now you make a very good case here that it's not as easy to change our minds as we think, and that when we believe a lot of crazy things, it's not quite what it seems, and so forth. But I suppose this doesn't really, if we go back to the beginning, which is the idea that the consensus is that human beings aren't really very rational after all, and we're being pushed around by other forces. I suppose I'm not sure why all this evidence shows we're more rational than we believe, rather than we just simply, it's harder to change our minds than we thought. Is that fair, or do you think if you look at this evidence as a whole, it actually shows we're more rational than we've been led to suppose?
That's a very good point. So the point I'm trying to make isn't that people are simply pig-headed, but that they are indeed, as you're suggesting, quite rational in the way they evaluate information. And just what happens in most of the contexts we've talked about, so typically in mass persuasion contexts, in political campaigns, in advertising, in propaganda, you don't have a lot of evidence telling you that you should change your mind. You don't know the person who is providing the propaganda or the advertising well or at all. You can't exchange arguments with them. And so in the absence of any good evidence that you should change your mind, you retreat in what you could call some kind of rational skepticism, and you kind of stick to your prior beliefs. By contrast, there is also quite a bit of evidence that when people do have good evidence that they should change their minds, then they do. So, when you see your GP, typically you will believe most of what he advises you to do because you've known him for years, and he's competent she's competent in her area of expertise. When a friend gives you good advice, you will tend to take it into account because they have your best interest at heart. And some of the evidence I've spent the most time studying because it relates to reason and argumentation, which were my kind of prior fields of study, is what happens when people exchange arguments. And contrary to a lot of pessimistic takes on this, which is interesting because people tend to believe that others are both kind of gullible in some contexts and extremely pig-headed in others, which is not exactly consistent. But people are actually quite good at changing their minds when you present them with good arguments. It's just that oftentimes it takes time, so you need to give them an argument, and then they're going to give you a counter argument. You need to address that, and there needs to have this back and forth. But when you do have this, there's a lot of experimental and kind of historical observational evidence, and that people do change their minds when they are presented with good arguments.
I mean, it's interesting because I think that the sort of idea of being what it means to be rational in the mind of a philosopher is to go through a conscious, rational argument. But of course, life is lived at normal speed, and we can't do that. And it seems that some of the mechanisms that you say that we use, these shortcuts and heuristics, in a sense, they are kind of rational, aren't they? So, for example, not changing your mind unless you've been given good reason to is actually a good rational heuristic. It's not the same as going through an argument to assess the negative claim. It's saying, I haven't got time to do all of that, but I'm going to use the weight of prior experience and conviction to override what even something might be superficially appealing about this. That seems to be a rational rule of thumb.
It is. And indeed, I mean, a problem that we had highlighted in our prior book with Dan about the philosopher's strategy of just doing it rationally is that you also rely on your intuitions. Like in the end, you have to rely on something that is intuitive. So, for instance, if you try to go through the steps, so I can believe that guy because he's a mechanic, and he's talking about my car, and mechanics tend to know a lot about cars. Obviously, that makes complete sense. But the intuition that because he's a mechanic and because he's talking about my car, then you should know what he's talking about. Why is that true? You can always go back one more step and like, well, yeah, but because it's people who have work in a given field, blah, blah, and you always have to rely on your intuitions in the end. So the only difference is how many steps do you make explicit? Do you just make none of them explicit, which is what we do in the vast majority of the cases? Or do you make a few more explicit if you're pondering an important decision or if you're a professional philosopher? But in the end, it all comes down to intuitions.
I mean, the title of our lecture series you were going to speak at was about the social dimension of knowledge. And one reason I wanted to invite you to that was your previous book, The Enigma of Reason, in which you talk a lot about how actually the experiments which seem to show how bad we are at reasoning are often sort of based on getting us to try things individually. And I mean, maybe to end on a hopeful note, I mean, first of all, as you say, when people are given good arguments, they change their minds. But to be given good arguments, that's a kind of a social process. And I do like this little experiment you've kind of got, which maybe we'll put on the screen. So it's a little logical puzzle, which actually, I mean, I find very difficult. John is looking at John is looking at Linda, and Linda is looking at Paul. John is married, Paul is not married. And the question is someone who is married looking at someone who is not married? Now, you'd have to look at that and see it and work it out. It's very difficult, and only about 10% of people get it right. When I saw you give a talk about this before, I think you kind of flattered the audience by telling them, I'm sure if you had a long time, you'd get it right. But that's probably not true, isn't it? I mean, I know of similar such experiments, right? But, I mean, what's interesting there is, so this kind of shows how bad we are at doing logic, so it seems. But we're open to argument and persuasions. What happens when you get people talking about that problem?
Hopefully the audience will see the problem, and then they'll take a minute to think about it. And so I'm going to give the answer now. So if you want to think about it, you should pause. Most people think that the correct answer is you can't tell because Linda, you don't know whether Linda is married or not. When in fact it doesn't matter, and I'm going to try to convince you now of why it doesn't matter. So Linda is either married or not married, and if Linda is married, so it's kind of hard for me without saying it. if Linda is married, then she's looking at Paul, who is not married, and so it's true that someone married is looking at someone who is not married. Whereas if Linda is not married, then John, who is married, is looking at her. And then you have someone who is married looking at someone who is not married. So I hope I got the names right, but someone will adopt the logic. Essentially, it is true in both the case in which Linda is married and she's not married, that someone married will be looking at someone who is not married, and so that is a good argument for the correct answer. And if you take your time and you think about it a little bit, everybody will come to see it as a good argument. The confound here, from a kind of experimental point of view, would be that, I'm the one who gave you the problem, so you should kind of trust what I'm telling you. And so what we do in our experiments is we put participants, naive participants, with each other, and as you are saying, about maybe 10% of them are going to get it right on their own, And when these people mix with people who got it wrong, they always, or nearly always, manage to convince others that the correct answer is yes. And we've seen that. We've seen that even if you take like a group of several dozen participants, and maybe if you have 2 or 3 will have gotten it right, and you can see the answer spread throughout the group as people not only convince others, but the people who have been convinced, they really understood why the correct answer was yes, and they are able to pass on that answer to other people. And so you see the whole group turning correct progressively, as long as you leave them enough time. So it takes 10, 15 minutes, but then everybody ends up getting it right.
I've got a little expression which I sort of learned through studying people like you and other people who work in this field called social epistemology, which is that I think, for me, the moral of the story is that we've always been told you should think for yourself. And that's kind of true, but you should never think by yourself. Think with other people is the best way to sort things out.
Yes,
Hugo, that's
yeah,
fascinating. Thank you very much for sparing the time for us.
My pleasure.
Hugo's talk was cancelled, but if you want to see him give a similar talk, just Google or use your favourite search engine to look for his Harvard talk, Rationality in the Evaluation of Communication. If you just search Hugo Mercier Harvard lecture, you'll get that. The new book is called Not Born Yesterday, which I've got here, it's fascinating and really interesting. And I'm very much of the view that you can't do philosophy in a vacuum. We really should be listening to what psychology has to say about that. This talk was from the Royal Institute of Philosophy. The Royal Institute organises a lot of events. Traditionally, they've been more in the flesh, but obviously they'll be changing as things happen in the future. So go to the website, have a look, sign up for updates, and maybe even subscribe to our journals if you like what you see. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Hugo Mercier.
Thank you very much, Julian. That was great.